Are you sure you're in the right place? Melissa's lips curled into a thin, dismissive smile as her eyes slowly scanned the woman standing in front of the counter, from the modest leather handbag to the understated blazer, to the calm expression she clearly did not expect. Another employee leaned closer, whispering just loud enough to be heard. These transactions usually involve real clients. A quiet chuckle followed. The black woman did not respond. She simply placed her card on the polished marble surface. Melissa did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, glancing toward the security guard. The gesture was subtle, but deliberate. Before we proceed, Melissa continued, her tone now colder. We need to confirm, this account actually belongs to you. A nearby customer paused mid-step, curiosity replacing indifference. The woman's fingers remained still beside the card. No trembling, no anger, just silence. Melissa finally picked up the card between two fingers, as if it might somehow not belong there. Because accounts with this kind of balance, she added softly, almost amused, don't usually look like this. No one in the lobby realized the quiet woman in front of them had already shaped the financial future of this very bank. And in less than 24 hours, everyone in that room would wish they had chosen different words. Stay with this story until the end. Because the truth behind that moment changed everything. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if stories about dignity, justice, and truth matter to you, consider subscribing so you never miss what the world needs to see. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than reaction. It was a lesson her mother repeated often while working late-night hospital shifts in Detroit, reminding her that composure was not weakness, but discipline. Growing up in a modest brick house on the east side of the city, Naomi did not inherit wealth, influence, or privilege. What she inherited was expectation, the quiet but constant understanding that she would need to work twice as hard to be seen as half as worthy. Her father, a mechanic who repaired engines with a patience bordering on artistry, often told her that the world rarely announced its unfairness. Instead, it revealed itself in moments so small that most people pretended not to notice. Naomi noticed everything. As a child, she developed the habit of observing before speaking. While other students rushed to answer questions, Naomi listened. While others competed for attention, she absorbed information. Her teachers described her as precise, self-contained, unusually focused. Numbers made sense to her in ways people often did not. At 13, she was already helping neighbors organize small business expenses. At 15, she had read every personal finance book available at the public library within bus distance of her home. She understood interest rates before most of her classmates understood credit cards. Her academic achievements opened doors that had never before been accessible to anyone in her immediate family. A full scholarship to Harvard allowed her to study economics under professors who quickly recognized the depth of her analytical thinking. Naomi did not speak often during lectures, but when she did, rooms became quiet. She did not waste words. She asked questions that reframed discussions. One professor later remarked that Naomi seemed less interested in theoretical wealth than in understanding the systems that decided who was allowed to build it. While many of her peers pursued careers in investment banking or corporate consulting immediately after graduation, Naomi chose a less visible path. She joined a small private equity firm that specialized in restructuring distressed regional institutions, companies often overlooked by larger investors. The work required patience, discretion, and an ability to identify value where others saw only risk. Naomi excelled in that environment. She developed a reputation for identifying structural weaknesses in financial models others assumed were stable. She rarely sought recognition. Instead, she built leverage. By the age of 32, Naomi had quietly founded Carter Global Strategic Holdings, a private investment firm operating with deliberate privacy. Unlike highly public venture capital firms that relied on visibility to attract deal flow, Naomi structured her company around confidentiality agreements that protected both her identity and her clients. Her philosophy was simple. Influence did not require publicity. In fact, publicity often weakened influence. Her firm focused on stabilizing institutions that provided essential services to local communities, mid-sized banks, infrastructure companies, regional healthcare networks. Naomi believed that when institutions collapsed, ordinary people paid the highest price. She did not view investment purely as profit generation. She viewed it as structural intervention. Carter Global became known within certain financial circles for decisive capital injections delivered at moments when organizations faced liquidity crises. Naomi did not negotiate through ego. She negotiated through data. When she entered a deal, she insisted on transparency, governance reform, and long-term sustainability metrics. She did not tolerate performative leadership or symbolic diversity statements without measurable change. Despite controlling investment capital exceeding hundreds of millions of dollars, Naomi's personal lifestyle remained intentionally restrained. She avoided social media visibility, rarely attended public galas, and declined magazine features that attempted to frame her as an inspirational figure. She disliked narratives that simplified complexity. Success to her was not an aesthetic. It was infrastructure. Her clothing reflected that philosophy. She preferred tailored garments in neutral tones, charcoal navy ivory fabrics that signaled professionalism without attracting unnecessary attention. Her jewelry was minimal, usually limited to small stud earrings, and a watch she had purchased after closing her firm's first major restructuring deal. She drove practical vehicles. She lived in a modern but understated apartment building overlooking Lake Michigan, selected more for its privacy than for its status. On the morning she entered Harrington and Cole Bank's downtown Chicago branch, Naomi's schedule included 3 meetings, 2 legal reviews, and a scheduled transfer connected to a strategic capital allocation. The transfer itself was routine within the scale of her firm's operations, but its timing was significant. Several institutional timelines depended on its completion that day. She entered the bank shortly after 9:40 a.m., 15 minutes after the doors opened to customers. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and freshly brewed coffee from a machine positioned discreetly near a seating area furnished with low leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows allowed late-morning light to reflect across marble surfaces, creating an atmosphere designed to communicate stability. Naomi paused briefly near the entrance, scanning the layout with practiced awareness. 4 teller stations, 2 customer service desks, 1 branch manager office with partially frosted glass. A security guard positioned near the main entrance posture, relaxed but observant. Several customers waited quietly, absorbed in their phones or paperwork. When Naomi approached the counter, she did so without hesitation. Her stride was steady, neither hurried nor slow. Her posture conveyed familiarity with professional environments where time carried measurable value. She greeted the teller politely and placed her identification and bank card on the counter surface. Her voice remained calm, clear, neutral. "I need to initiate a transfer this morning." The statement itself carried no drama, no emphasis, no explanation beyond what was necessary. From Naomi's perspective, the interaction should have required no more than several minutes. But small deviations in tone often signal larger intentions. The teller's eyes lingered longer than necessary. The polite smile did not reach her eyes. Fingers hesitated before touching the card. Naomi noticed the hesitation immediately. She did not yet know that within the next 20 minutes. The room's perception of her presence would begin to shift, and she did not yet know that the same institution now questioning her legitimacy had once depended entirely on a decision she made quietly, without recognition. The transfer request she submitted that morning was not unusual for her firm, but for the employees observing her across the polished counter, nothing about her presence aligned with their expectations, and expectation, when left unexamined, often reveals more than intention ever admits. Melissa Grant had worked at Harrington and Coal Bank for 6 years, long enough to believe she understood the patterns of the lobby as clearly as the daily rhythm of deposits and withdrawals. She believed she could identify a high-value client before they even reached the counter. Expensive watches, confident impatience, tailored designer suits that announced wealth before conversation ever began. She trusted those signals more than she trusted the data on her screen. So when Naomi Carter placed her card on the marble surface, Melissa's first reaction was not curiosity. It was quiet skepticism. Melissa forced a professional smile, but the delay before she spoke was noticeable. "Good morning," she said, her voice measured. "How may I help you today?" Naomi met her gaze calmly. "I need to initiate a transfer." Melissa nodded, typing slowly, deliberately. "Of course." Her eyes flicked between Naomi's face and the computer screen. Something about the interaction did not align with her internal assumptions. Naomi's clothing was elegant but understated. No visible luxury logos, no performative display of wealth, no impatience. Melissa inserted the card into the reader, then paused again as the account profile loaded. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. The account balance did not match her expectation. She blinked once, then twice, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. 7 figures in available liquidity. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard longer than necessary. "I'm sorry," Melissa said, her tone shifting slightly. "Can you confirm the amount of the transfer?" $750,000? Naomi replied evenly. The words seemed to echo louder than they should have in the quiet lobby. Melissa's eyebrows lifted before she could stop the reaction. "That is a significant transfer," she said carefully. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "Yes." Melissa clicked through additional verification screens, her posture stiffening as she navigated the system. A small alert icon appeared beside the account number, not unusual for large transactions, but enough to justify additional questions. "May I ask the purpose of the transfer?" Melissa asked. "It is a business allocation," Naomi answered. Melissa hesitated. "To which institution? A partner firm?" Melissa typed slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Have you completed transactions of this size here?" before she continued. Naomi watched her calmly. "Yes." Melissa clicked again, scrolling through the account history. There they were. Multiple transactions exceeding $500,000 over the past 2 years. Each approved, each processed without incident. Yet Melissa still felt an unfamiliar resistance forming. "I just need to confirm some information," she said, though the system had not requested additional verification beyond standard procedure. She stood up from her chair. "Please give me 1 moment." Naomi nodded once. Melissa walked quickly toward the glass office at the side of the lobby, where branch manager Daniel Brooks was reviewing printed reports. She knocked lightly and stepped inside, lowering her voice. "There's a transfer request," she said quietly. $750,000. Daniel looked up immediately, from which client Melissa handed him the printed account summary. Daniel scanned the page, his expression tightening. "Do we know her?" "I don't recognize the name," Melissa admitted. Daniel studied the account profile again. The balance was substantial. The transaction history consistent. No overdrafts, no irregular deposits. Everything appeared structurally sound. Yet something about the situation felt unusual to him, though he could not immediately identify why. "Did she explain the purpose of the transfer?" he asked. She said business allocation, Melissa replied. But something feels off. Daniel tapped the paper lightly against the desk. Off? How Melissa hesitated, searching for a justification that sounded procedural rather than instinctive. She doesn't present like most clients at this tier. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Large transfers require caution, he said after a moment. He stood and adjusted the cuff of his shirt before walking toward the teller counter with controlled composure. Naomi remained exactly where Melissa had left her. Her hands rested calmly near the edge of the marble surface. Fingers relaxed, posture unchanged. Daniel approached with a polite but distant expression. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Daniel Brooks' branch manager. I understand you're requesting a transfer of $750,000. "That is correct," Naomi replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "For security purposes, we occasionally request additional verification for transactions above certain thresholds." Naomi watched him without reacting. "I have already provided identification," she said evenly. "Yes," Daniel acknowledged. "We simply want to ensure everything is processed correctly." A nearby customer glanced toward the interaction, sensing the subtle tension forming beneath professional language. Daniel continued, "Would you mind confirming the source of the funds involved in this transaction?" Naomi's gaze remained steady. "The funds originate from my firm's operating account," she said. Daniel offered a small nod, though his expression remained guarded. "And the receiving institution, a strategic partner." Daniel pressed his lips together briefly. "Of course." He turned slightly toward Melissa. "Let's flag this for extended verification," he said quietly. Melissa nodded immediately. The phrase extended verification carried implications beyond its neutral wording. It meant delay, scrutiny, suspicion framed as diligence. Naomi noticed the shift immediately. "I was not informed that additional review would be necessary," she said calmly. Daniel offered a measured smile. "These steps help protect our clients," he replied. Naomi's voice remained even. "I am aware of standard financial compliance protocols." Daniel inclined his head slightly, but did not alter his decision. "We appreciate your patience." Melissa began entering additional review codes into the system, her fingers moving with performative deliberation. The process that should have required minutes began stretching into something noticeably longer. A faint whisper passed between two employees at the adjacent station. One of them glanced toward Naomi, then quickly looked away. The security guard near the entrance adjusted his stance, subtly shifting his weight as if responding to an unspoken cue. Naomi remained still. Her composure did not change. But inside she recognized the familiar pattern unfolding, the gradual transformation of a routine transaction into a quiet test of legitimacy. She had encountered similar moments before. Moments when professionalism was not enough to prevent doubt. Moments when credentials were requested twice. Moments when tone replaced evidence. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply observed. Daniel returned to his office briefly, leaving Melissa to continue the verification process. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Each second, adding quiet weight to the atmosphere. Finally, Naomi spoke. "Is there a specific concern regarding my account?" Melissa did not meet her eyes immediately. "We just want to be absolutely certain everything aligns correctly," she said. Naomi nodded once. "I see." The words carried no accusation, no frustration, just acknowledgement. Yet something about the stillness in her response made the interaction feel heavier. Because while the staff believed they were evaluating her legitimacy, they had no idea that years earlier she had already evaluated theirs, and made a decision that allowed this very institution to continue operating. A decision no one in the room had ever been told about. A decision that would soon change the tone of every voice in that building. Daniel Brooks returned from his office with a tablet in his hand, and a carefully composed expression that suggested control, even though a faint tension lingered in the way his fingers gripped the device. Years of management experience had taught him that authority was often communicated through tone rather than content. The appearance of calm could influence how situations unfolded, especially when uncertainty entered the room. He stopped at the counter, positioning himself slightly beside Melissa, but angled toward Naomi, creating an arrangement that subtly shifted the balance of the interaction. It was no longer a simple teller transaction. It had become a managerial review. Ms. Carter Daniel said, reading the name from the account profile as though he had not already memorized it. "Thank you for your patience." Naomi gave a small nod. Daniel tapped lightly on the tablet screen. "As part of our internal compliance procedures, certain transaction patterns require us to perform enhanced verification." Naomi's gaze remained steady. "This is not the first transaction of this scale from this account," she replied calmly. Daniel acknowledged the statement with a brief incline of his head, but did not step back. "Yes, we can see prior activity," he said. "However, each transaction must still be evaluated independently." The phrasing sounded reasonable, professional, neutral, yet the implication hung between them. Naomi noticed that Daniel did not ask similar questions of the man 2 counters down, who was loudly discussing the purchase of a second vacation property, while a teller processed his request without hesitation. "Is there any irregularity in the account history?" Naomi asked. Daniel paused briefly. "No irregularities," he admitted. "We simply maintain rigorous standards." Melissa remained focused on the monitor, though her typing had slowed noticeably. She opened additional windows, cross-checking identification codes that the system had already verified moments earlier. Daniel continued. "May I ask what industry your business operates in?" "Financial restructuring," Naomi replied. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And the receiving institution?" "A strategic partner firm." Daniel nodded again, though the repetition of the answer did not appear to satisfy him. A quiet shift in atmosphere began spreading across the lobby. Conversation softened. The subtle awareness that something unusual was occurring drew attention without anyone openly acknowledging it. One customer glanced toward Naomi, then toward Daniel, attempting to interpret the dynamic unfolding between them. Another customer leaned slightly closer to the counter, pretending to examine brochures while clearly listening. Daniel placed one hand lightly on the counter surface. "You understand," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "that large transfers sometimes trigger additional questions." Naomi met his gaze directly. "I understand regulatory frameworks," she said. Her tone remained respectful, but precise. Daniel sensed the confidence in her response, yet something within him resisted adjusting his approach. "Of course," he said. "Still, we must be thorough." Melissa turned her screen slightly toward Daniel, pointing discreetly at the transaction record. "All documentation appears valid," she whispered. Daniel studied the numbers again. The balance remained substantial, consistent, verified, yet expectation continued to interfere with acceptance. He had encountered high-net-worth clients before. Many arrived with subtle signals of financial status, recognizable luxury brands, familiar surnames, visible networks of influence. Naomi Carter presented none of those signals in ways he instinctively recognized. Instead, she presented composure. Composure to Daniel did not automatically translate into credibility. "I'm going to request a secondary identity confirmation," he said. Naomi reached calmly into her bag and produced an additional form of identification without hesitation. Daniel examined the document carefully. Valid, consistent, unquestionably legitimate. Yet instead of concluding the review, he continued. "Have you recently updated your contact information? Num. Changed business structure? Num. Authorized additional users? Num. Melissa glanced briefly at Daniel as if silently suggesting the review had reached its reasonable conclusion. Daniel did not acknowledge the cue. Large movements of capital sometimes correlate with unusual activity patterns, he continued. Naomi's expression did not change. My firm manages multiple capital allocations daily, she said. Daniel gave a polite but restrained smile. Of course. At the far end of this counter, a man in an expensive suit completed a transaction exceeding $1 million with minimal conversation. The teller assisting him smiled warmly, thanking him for his continued trust in the bank. Naomi noticed the difference. She did not comment. The contrast spoke clearly enough. Melissa cleared her throat softly. The transfer destination account has been verified, she said quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. Let's proceed carefully, he replied. The words suggested caution, but also hesitation. Naomi placed both hands lightly on the counter surface. Is there a specific concern regarding compliance? She asked. Daniel paused. No specific concern, he admitted. Then the transaction should be processed according to standard procedure, Naomi said calmly. Daniel hesitated long enough for the silence to become noticeable. We aim to ensure all activity aligns with expected client profiles, he said finally. The phrase lingered in the air. Expected client profiles. Naomi understood exactly what the statement implied, and she recognized the familiar tension between documented fact and perceived legitimacy. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to extend just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. Behind her, one of the waiting customers shifted uncomfortably. Another checked the time on his phone. The security guard glanced briefly toward Daniel, awaiting subtle instruction that never fully materialized. Melissa refreshed the transaction screen again, though nothing had changed. All indicators remained approved. Verified, authorized. Daniel adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, a gesture that suggested internal uncertainty. We appreciate your cooperation, he said. Naomi inclined her head slightly. I appreciate procedural consistency, she replied. Her tone remained calm, but the precision of her language introduced a quiet pressure Daniel could not easily dismiss, because procedures when applied selectively often reveal more than intentions ever state openly. Daniel finally nodded toward Melissa. Continue processing, he said. Melissa entered the authorization sequence. Yet instead of finalizing the transfer, she paused once more. System recommends manager approval code, she said. Daniel pressed his lips together. He entered the code slowly. The screen displayed a final verification prompt. For a brief moment, the transaction hovered between completion and delay. Naomi watched the screen without visible emotion. Inside, however, she recognized something else entirely unfolding. Not merely hesitation, not merely caution, but a pattern she had seen before in boardrooms negotiations, and financial reviews where credentials were weighed differently depending on who presented them. Daniel pressed confirm. The system began processing the transfer. Yet even as the progress indicator moved forward, the atmosphere in the lobby remained unsettled. Because doubt, once introduced, rarely disappears immediately. It lingers. It shapes perception. And sometimes, it exposes more about the observer than the person being observed. Daniel believed the situation was nearly resolved. But within the internal systems of the bank's headquarters, a separate notification had already been triggered by the transaction. A notification connected to a name few employees at this branch had ever seen before. A name associated with a decision made 3 years earlier, a decision that prevented Harrington and Cole Bank from collapsing during its most vulnerable moment. A decision made quietly, without publicity, without recognition, by the same woman now standing calmly at the counter, and within minutes, that connection would begin to surface. The transfer request remained suspended in a quiet, digital limbo, the thin progress bar inching forward with mechanical indifference, unaware of the human tension building around it. Naomi Carter stood without shifting her posture, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the subtle unease spreading through the Harrington and Cole lobby. Nothing visible had changed. The polished marble floors reflected the same filtered morning light. Keyboards continued clicking softly, and customers maintained the polite silence expected in financial institutions, yet the atmosphere felt heavier, now charged with unspoken assumptions. Melissa Grant tried to appear focused on her screen, but her attention kept drifting back to Naomi's face, searching for signs of discomfort that never appeared. She was accustomed to reading reactions quickly, impatience from executives, anxiety from small business owners, irritation from clients, unaccustomed to waiting. But Naomi revealed nothing. Her composure unsettled Melissa more than visible frustration would have. Daniel Brooks stepped a few feet away from the counter, maintaining proximity without fully disengaging from the situation. He folded his hands in front of him, then unfolded them again, performing small gestures of professionalism that concealed an unfamiliar uncertainty. The numbers on the screen clearly authorized the transfer. The documentation aligned. Yet something in him still resisted pressing the final confirmation with confidence. Two customers seated near the waiting area pretended to scroll through their phones, though their eyes lifted periodically toward the interaction unfolding near the teller station. People rarely admitted curiosity in spaces designed for discretion, but tension drew attention naturally. A faint whisper traveled between two employees working at adjacent desks. "That's a large amount," one murmured. "Do you know her?" the other asked quietly. A subtle shake of the head. Melissa clicked through additional tabs, reopening files already verified moments earlier. The repetition served no technical purpose, but it created the appearance of diligence, Naomi noticed. Patterns of delay often revealed more about decision-making psychology than policy manuals ever acknowledged. The security guard near the entrance adjusted his stance again, shifting weight from one foot to the other. His posture remained neutral, yet his gaze lingered slightly longer in Naomi's direction than necessary. It was not overt suspicion. It was quiet monitoring, the kind that suggested possibility without evidence. Daniel stepped closer once more. "Large transfers sometimes require internal notation," he said, as though offering explanation that had not been requested. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "I understand documentation procedures," she replied. Her voice remained measured, neither defensive nor accommodating. Daniel nodded, though the exchange did not reduce the tension he felt. Behind Naomi, a man in a navy suit approached another teller and requested a cashier's check for $200,000. The teller assisting him smiled warmly, making light conversation about interest rates and market conditions while processing the request efficiently. Naomi observed the interaction in her peripheral vision. Efficiency appeared selective. Melissa finally spoke again. "The system is performing a secondary confirmation sweep," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Naomi met her gaze. "Is that standard for all transactions of this size?" she asked. Melissa hesitated. "For certain profiles," she replied. The wording lingered in the air longer than intended. "Certain profiles." Daniel cleared his throat softly. "We apply layered security measures to ensure client protection," he said. Naomi nodded once. "Protection should be consistent," she replied. Melissa's fingers paused above the keyboard. Daniel offered a polite smile that did not fully conceal discomfort. "We strive for consistency," he said. Another employee walked past carrying a folder, slowing slightly as he sensed the tension near the counter. He did not stop, but his curiosity registered in the brief shift of his eyes. Time passed. 30 seconds. 45. Each small delay extended the emotional distance between professionalism and presumption. Naomi remained still, her breathing slow and even. She had experienced similar moments before, moments when systems functioned correctly, but interpretation introduced friction. She understood that bias rarely announced itself loudly. More often it disguised itself as precaution. Melissa refreshed the authorization window again. Approved. Daniel glanced at the screen. Still approved. Nothing in the system justified continued hesitation. Yet hesitation remained. "I just want to ensure everything aligns perfectly," Daniel said, almost as if reassuring himself. Naomi's expression remained composed. "Accuracy is always appropriate," she replied. Her calm precision created an unexpected imbalance in the interaction. Daniel had anticipated defensiveness, perhaps irritation. Instead, he encountered clarity, the kind that made additional questioning feel increasingly unnecessary. A young employee seated near the customer service desk opened an internal messaging platform, typing briefly before pausing. Something about the account identifier triggered a faint recognition he could not immediately place. He searched the internal database quietly. Meanwhile, Melissa reviewed the signature verification screen once more. Match confirmed. She compared the ID photo with Naomi's face. Match confirmed. Daniel exhaled slowly. "All indicators appear aligned," Melissa said. Daniel nodded. And yet he replied quietly, "We must remain vigilant." Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to expand not as resistance, but as observation. In environments built on trust, hesitation communicates its own message. Behind her, a soft mechanical sound signaled the opening of the main entrance as another customer entered the bank. Morning light shifted slightly across the floor, illuminating the counter's reflective surface. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the marble edge. "You understand the importance of verification," he said. Naomi met his gaze directly. "I understand the importance of fairness," she replied. Melissa looked down quickly, resuming her typing. The words were not confrontational. They were precise. And precision often reveals imbalance without raising volume. At the far end of this room, the young employee's search returned a result within the internal archival system, a restricted document referencing institutional restructuring agreements from 3 years earlier. The employee leaned slightly closer to the monitor. A familiar name appeared in the investor registry summary. Carter Global Strategic Holdings. He frowned slightly, unsure why the name felt significant. The document required senior-level clearance to view in full. He minimized the window, uncertain whether the connection was relevant. At the counter, Melissa finally prepared to finalize the transfer. Daniel watched the confirmation screen closely, as though expecting something unexpected to appear. Naomi remained still, calm, patient. Yet beneath the surface of the bank's internal systems, a chain of automated notifications had already begun routing information toward executive oversight channels, triggered by the size and structural significance of the transaction origin. Those notifications did not rely on personal perception. They relied on recorded institutional memory, and institutional memory, unlike individual bias, rarely forgets its benefactors. Within minutes, information would begin traveling beyond the walls of the Chicago branch. Information that would reframe the interaction entirely. But for now, the quiet tension remained suspended between assumption and fact. A space where interpretation still held influence. A space where perception still guided tone. A space where one decision, made years earlier by Naomi Carter, without public acknowledgement, was about to return not as recognition, but as revelation. And when that revelation arrived, the silence currently surrounding her would feel very different. The transfer confirmation window remained open on Melissa Grant's screen, its neutral interface displaying a sequence of green indicators that should have signaled completion. Every data point aligned, identification verified, signature matched, account history stable, compliance markers satisfied. Yet the process continued to stretch beyond its natural conclusion, shaped less by technical requirements and more by perception that refused to quietly correct itself. Daniel Brooks shifted his stance beside the counter, maintaining a polite distance that still communicated authority. His tone remained controlled, but a subtle firmness had entered his voice, the kind used when someone believed they were performing due diligence beyond standard expectation. Ms. Carter Daniel began adjusting the cuff of his sleeve again for clarity. "Could you briefly describe the nature of your firm's operations?" Naomi looked at him calmly. "My firm specializes in financial restructuring and capital stabilization," she replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "And your role within the company?" "I am the founder." Melissa's fingers paused above the keyboard again. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but his eyebrows lifted slightly. "You are the sole decision-maker for transactions of this scale?" "Yes," Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. "That is a significant level of responsibility." "It is," Naomi answered. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Most clients managing portfolios of this magnitude typically maintain visible advisory teams," he said carefully. Naomi met his gaze. "My firm employs analysts, legal counsel, and compliance officers," she replied. "But the authorization authority remains mine." Melissa glanced briefly toward Daniel. He continued. "And the funds originate from operational revenue streams, yes. Generated through restructuring agreements, yes." Daniel gave a small nod, though the repetition did not appear to reduce his curiosity. A faint shift in the room's atmosphere followed each question. Conversations near the waiting area grew quieter. The tension was not dramatic, but it was noticeable the way subtle scrutiny alters the rhythm of otherwise routine spaces. Daniel placed both hands lightly on the counter surface. "You understand," he said, "that transactions approaching $750,000 often involve layered review." Naomi's posture remained composed. "I understand compliance thresholds," she replied. Daniel gave a thin smile. "It is rare," he said, choosing his words carefully, "for individuals to personally authorize transfers of this magnitude without representation physically present." Naomi's eyes remained steady. "I represent my own firm." Melissa looked down quickly, focusing on the keyboard, as though the conversation did not concern her. Daniel continued. "In many cases, clients prefer discretion supported by formal intermediaries. Discretion is precisely why I am here, personally," Naomi said. Daniel nodded once. "Of course." A brief silence settled. Melissa cleared her throat softly. "The transaction has passed standard verification," she said quietly. Daniel did not immediately respond. Instead, he studied Naomi again, as though attempting to reconcile documentation with expectation. "Would you be comfortable confirming the intended allocation category?" he asked. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "Capital partnership distribution?" Daniel pressed his lips together briefly. "For institutional expansion purposes." "Yes." Daniel tapped the edge of the tablet lightly against his palm. "May I ask which sector the receiving entity operates within?" "Regional infrastructure finance." Daniel nodded slowly again. "An increasingly complex sector." "It requires long-term perspective," Naomi said calmly. Daniel's expression softened slightly, though hesitation remained. Melissa attempted to move the interaction forward. "I can finalize the authorization," she said quietly. Daniel raised one finger, gently signaling patience. "One final confirmation," he said. Naomi did not react outwardly. Yet each additional question extended the implication that evidence alone was insufficient. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "You understand that unusual activity patterns sometimes warrant extended review." Naomi met his gaze without blinking. "This activity pattern is consistent with prior transactions," she replied. Daniel paused. Yes, he admitted. Melissa's fingers hovered over the final confirmation button. The system displayed no warning indicators, no risk flags, no irregularities. Yet the delay continued. A woman seated in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, sensing the prolonged interaction had moved beyond routine verification. Another customer glanced toward Naomi with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Daniel finally spoke again. "It is simply important that we ensure complete accuracy," he said. Naomi nodded once. "Accuracy should rely on data," she replied. Melissa inhaled quietly. Daniel folded his arms briefly, then unfolded them again. "Many institutions face increasing exposure to fraudulent representation," he said carefully. Naomi's expression remained neutral. "I am familiar with fraud prevention frameworks," she replied. Daniel offered a polite nod. Of course. The repetition of cautious language created an atmosphere that felt increasingly disproportionate to the transaction itself. Melissa finally spoke again. "The signature confirmation has cleared," she said. Daniel glanced at the screen. The biometric match indicator displayed a full verification score, everything aligned. And yet the tone of the interaction had already communicated something else entirely. Daniel tapped lightly on the counter. "Have you previously conducted business directly through this branch?" he asked. "Yes. Under the same account structure?" "Yes." Melissa finally pressed the confirmation key sequence. The system began processing the transaction. Estimated completion time less than 60 seconds. Daniel watched the progress bar closely, as though expecting additional prompts to appear. None did. Naomi rested her hands calmly at the counter's edge. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. The composure itself became its own quiet response. Because moments of subtle humiliation rarely arrive through explicit statements. They emerge through tone, through repetition, through unnecessary questioning framed as procedure. Daniel finally spoke again. "Large capital flows often involve institutional visibility," he said. "My firm maintains necessary transparency," Naomi replied. Daniel nodded slowly. Melissa printed the preliminary confirmation receipt. The machine's soft mechanical hum sounded unusually loud in the quiet lobby. As the paper emerged, Melissa hesitated briefly before handing it across the counter. Naomi accepted it calmly. Daniel exhaled slowly. "We appreciate your cooperation with our verification protocols," he said. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate consistency in their application," she replied. Her tone remained composed, but the precision of the statement introduced a quiet weight Daniel could not easily dismiss. Because consistency, once mentioned, invites reflection. And reflection sometimes reveals imbalance that had previously remained unexamined. Across the room, the junior employee reopened the archived institutional document, briefly scanning the summary paragraph again. A phrase stood out this time. "Primary stabilization capital provided through Carter Global Strategic Holdings." He frowned slightly. The connection felt incomplete but notable. He closed the window again, uncertain whether to raise the observation prematurely. Meanwhile, Melissa finalized the transaction log entry. Status approved, completed. Routine according to the system. Unusual according to perception. Naomi placed the receipt carefully inside her folder. She did not mention the extended delay. She did not question the tone. She did not display visible frustration. But the quiet observation remained. Because moments like this rarely disappear completely. They accumulate, and sometimes they return unexpectedly. Within the bank's executive network, automated alerts tied to capital movement thresholds had already begun routing summary data to senior leadership channels. Those alerts did not interpret appearances. They referenced records that contained decisions made years earlier. decisions that connected directly to the stability of Harrington and Cole Bank. And soon, those records would reach someone who immediately recognized the name Naomi Carter. Although the transaction had technically been approved, the emotional residue of the interaction remained suspended in the air like a faint static charge no one openly acknowledged. Naomi Carter did not immediately leave the counter. Instead, she calmly reviewed the printed confirmation, her eyes moving across each line with quiet precision. Accuracy mattered, details mattered, and moments like this often revealed more than financial outcomes ever could. Melissa Grant shifted slightly in her chair, unsure whether the situation had fully concluded. The silence felt longer than it should have. Daniel Brooks cleared his throat gently. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, though the reassurance seemed directed more toward himself than Naomi. Naomi placed the confirmation document neatly into a slim folder. "Thank you," she said. Her tone was polite, neutral, unhurried. Yet Daniel did not step away. Instead, he spoke again. "For documentation purposes, we sometimes conduct additional internal review on transactions of this magnitude." Naomi paused. "You indicated the transfer was approved," she replied. "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "Approved. Of course. This is simply part of our risk monitoring structure." Melissa glanced briefly at him, surprised the conversation was continuing. Daniel continued. "Certain transaction profiles require post-authorization validation." Naomi met his gaze. What type of validation? Daniel hesitated for half a second too long. "Pattern consistency analysis," he said. The phrase sounded technical, but vague. Naomi remained composed. "My transaction history reflects similar allocations," she replied. "Yes," Daniel acknowledged. "However, institutions must remain vigilant regarding unauthorized account access." The implication was subtle, yet unmistakable. Melissa adjusted papers on her desk, avoiding direct eye contact. Naomi spoke calmly. "You are suggesting potential account compromise." Daniel lifted his hands slightly in a gesture meant to soften the suggestion. "We are not suggesting anything," he said carefully. "We are confirming stability." Naomi's expression did not change. "My identity has been verified twice," she said. Daniel nodded. "Yes. My signature has been verified." "Yes. My transaction history is consistent." "Yes." Daniel exhaled slowly. "These steps protect all parties involved," he said. A customer waiting behind Naomi shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unusual continuation of a completed transaction. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not display irritation, but the precision of her questions left little room for ambiguity. "What additional information is required?" she asked. Melissa finally spoke. "No additional documentation is required at this time," she said quietly. Daniel gave her a brief look. She lowered her eyes again. Daniel turned back to Naomi. "May I confirm the length of time you have maintained this account?" 3 years, Naomi replied. Daniel tapped lightly on the tablet. "And the account has been under your sole control during that period, yes?" Daniel nodded again. "And the initial deposit source?" Naomi's gaze remained steady. "A capital restructuring agreement." Daniel hesitated. "With which institution?" Naomi paused for the first time. "A regional financial entity," she said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Harrington and Cole Bank was among the institutions stabilized during that fiscal cycle," she added calmly. Melissa's fingers stopped moving entirely. Daniel blinked once. The statement seemed to pass through him without immediate comprehension. "I see," he said, though his tone suggested he did not fully process the implication. Naomi did not elaborate further. She simply allowed the words to settle. Because information delivered without emphasis often takes longer to register. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. "Yes. Well," he said, "many firms participate in restructuring markets." Naomi inclined her head slightly. They do. Daniel glanced briefly toward Melissa's screen again. All indicators remain consistent, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Yet instead of concluding the interaction, he spoke once more. Do you conduct most of your financial activity through this branch, not exclusively? Daniel gave a small nod. Diversification of institutional relationships is common. Yes. Another pause settled between them. The security guard near the entrance observed the exchange with subtle curiosity, though no explicit signal had been given. Daniel finally stepped back slightly. We appreciate your cooperation, he said again. Naomi closed the folder. Her movements remained calm, deliberate, controlled. Consistency is always appreciated, she replied. As she prepared to turn, Melissa spoke, hesitantly. Ms. Carter, will you require confirmation notification once settlement completes? Yes, Naomi said. We can arrange secure delivery, Melissa offered. That will not be necessary, Naomi replied calmly. Standard confirmation is sufficient. Melissa nodded. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag slightly. Her posture remained poised, unshaken. Yet something in the atmosphere had shifted subtly, because the suggestion of account compromise had introduced a quiet line that could not easily be erased. Even when framed as policy, even when softened by polite language. Daniel spoke once more. These procedures help prevent unauthorized financial activity. Naomi met his gaze directly. Unauthorized activity is prevented by evidence, she replied. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly. Yes, he said. Naomi gave a small nod, then finally stepped away from the counter. The distance of only a few steps seemed to release tension that had accumulated across the marble surface. Melissa exhaled quietly once Naomi's back was turned. Daniel watched her walk toward the exit. Calm, measured, unhurried. Across the room, the junior employee reopened the archived institutional document again, this time reading more carefully. The restructuring agreement summary listed multiple contributing entities. One entry appeared highlighted in bold formatting. Primary capital guarantor, Carter Global Strategic Holdings. He scrolled further. A restricted annotation indicated stabilization funds authorized through principal partner Naomi Carter. The employee's eyes widened slightly. He minimized the document quickly, uncertain whether he had misinterpreted the significance. At the same moment, the bank's internal alert system generated an executive-level notification triggered by capital movement patterns associated with legacy restructuring agreements. The notification routed automatically to senior leadership channels at headquarters. Daniel remained unaware. Melissa remained unaware. The lobby remained calm, but information was already moving beyond the walls of the branch. Information that would soon introduce clarity where assumption had guided tone. Naomi reached the entrance. The security guard opened the door politely. Have a good day, he said. You as well, Naomi replied. The door closed softly behind her. Inside the branch, Daniel adjusted his tie, slightly attempting to restore the sense of normalcy he believed had briefly slipped. Yet the quiet after the interaction felt different. Because sometimes a routine moment becomes significant only after it has already passed. And sometimes institutions discover too late that they have just questioned the very person who ensured their survival. The glass door of Harrington and Cole Bank had barely settled back into its frame when the stillness inside the branch began to fracture under the quiet weight of uncertainty. Naomi Carter's departure should have marked the end of the interaction. The transaction had been approved, documentation confirmed, and procedural language carefully applied. Yet the emotional imprint of the encounter remained embedded in the atmosphere like a faint echo that refused to fully dissipate. Melissa Grant stared at her screen longer than necessary, rereading the completed transaction log, even though nothing had changed. Every verification box was marked. every compliance field validated. The system recognized the transaction as ordinary, routine, structurally sound. Yet Melissa did not feel the sense of closure she expected. Daniel Brooks returned to his office, closing the glass door behind him halfway, a habit he developed when attempting to think through situations that left him unsettled but not yet fully understood. He placed the tablet on his desk and reviewed the transaction summary again, as though searching for confirmation that his caution had been justified. $750,000. Cleared, consistent with account history. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Nothing irregular, he murmured to himself. Yet the interaction replayed in his mind with unusual persistence. The calm precision in Naomi's responses, the lack of hesitation in her documentation, the absence of defensiveness when questioned repeatedly. Daniel prided himself on reading people. He believed experience allowed him to identify potential risks quickly, but something about the certainty he initially felt had begun to weaken. Across the lobby, Melissa reopened the client profile once more. Account holder, Naomi Carter. Account classification, institutional partner tier. Her eyes paused briefly on the classification label. Institutional partner tier. That designation was not typical for individual clients. She clicked into the internal notes section. Restricted access. Authorization required. Melissa frowned slightly. She had not noticed the classification earlier. The junior employee at the customer service desk glanced toward Melissa, hesitating before speaking. "Did you notice the account structure code?" he asked quietly. Melissa turned her chair slightly. "What about it?" He lowered his voice. "It's linked to legacy restructuring capital." Melissa blinked once. "That would explain the transaction size," she said. He nodded slightly. "But not the partner classification," he added. Melissa looked back at the screen. Her pulse increased slightly, though she did not yet understand why. Meanwhile, Daniel opened the internal compliance dashboard from his office terminal. Transaction summary displayed standard clearance indicators. Yet an additional automated alert appeared at the bottom of the interface, executive visibility triggered. Daniel frowned. That notification did not typically appear for routine branch-level transactions. He clicked the alert summary. Routing channel senior oversight review. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He had not anticipated escalation beyond internal compliance. Melissa knocked lightly on his office door. "Daniel," she said. He looked up. "Yes. Have you ever seen an institutional partner classification tied to an individual client?" she asked. Daniel paused. "Rarely," he admitted. Melissa stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "There's a restricted annotation in the account notes," she added. Daniel's expression sharpened. "What type of annotation?" "Legacy capital involvement," Melissa said quietly. Daniel opened the expanded profile fields. "Access limited. Executive clearance required." He exhaled slowly. "That explains the alert," he murmured. Melissa folded her arms lightly. "Do you think compliance will request additional documentation?" she asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. "If the system triggered executive visibility, the review may occur automatically." Melissa nodded. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside the office, the junior employee refreshed the archival document once more, carefully scanning the institutional summary section. The restructuring agreement, dated 3 years earlier, referenced a financial stabilization package delivered during a period of regional liquidity crisis. Several institutions were listed, Harrington and Cole Bank among them. Primary capital guarantor Carter Global Strategic Holdings. Principal authorization signature Naomi Carter. The employee sat back slowly. The connection now felt unmistakable. He stood hesitated, then walked toward Daniel's office. He knocked gently, Yes, Daniel said. I think you may want to see this, the employee said quietly, placing a printed summary on the desk. Daniel scanned the document. His eyes stopped at the signature authorization line. Naomi Carter. His expression changed immediately. That can't be... He began, then stopped. Melissa leaned slightly closer to read the page. Her face went still. That's the same client, she said quietly. Daniel read the summary again. 3 years earlier, Harrington and Cole Bank had experienced severe liquidity strain during a regional lending contraction. Several investors had withdrawn capital simultaneously, creating a structural vulnerability that threatened branch closures. The document showed Carter Global Strategic Holdings as the primary stabilization capital provider. Without that capital injection, the bank would have been forced to consolidate operations significantly, possibly close multiple locations, possibly restructure leadership, possibly cease independent operation entirely. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. The silence in the office felt heavier than any tension earlier in the day. Melissa spoke softly. She said her firm specialized in restructuring. Daniel nodded slowly. The memory of her calm tone returned with uncomfortable clarity. I asked her to confirm the source of her own capital, he said quietly. The words sounded different now. Melissa looked toward the glass wall separating the office from the lobby. She didn't correct us, she said. Daniel exhaled slowly. No, he replied. The junior employee shifted uncomfortably. I didn't realize the connection until now, he admitted. Daniel nodded. Neither did I. Neither. Outside the lobby continued functioning as usual, unaware that the significance of the morning's interaction had just changed entirely. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. Has the transfer fully settled? He asked. Melissa checked the system. Yes, she said quietly. Daniel nodded again. Yet the completion of the transaction no longer felt like closure. Instead, it felt like the beginning of accountability, because information had now moved beyond interpretation, beyond assumption, beyond perception. It had entered the realm of documented fact. Melissa spoke again. Executive visibility alerts usually trigger senior review within the hour, she said. Daniel glanced toward the printed summary again. The name Naomi Carter now carried context he had not considered earlier. Not simply a client, not simply an account holder, but a financial decision-maker connected directly to the institution's survival. Daniel stood slowly. I want compliance notified that we are reviewing the interaction record, he said. Melissa nodded. The junior employee stepped back quietly. Outside morning light continued reflecting across the polished floor, unchanged by the shift in understanding occurring within the glass office. Daniel looked once more at the document. Primary capital guarantor, Naomi Carter. The word settled heavily. Because sometimes the moment when perception changes arrives too late to alter behavior. And sometimes the realization of significance emerges only after the opportunity to demonstrate fairness has already passed. Within the bank's executive communication network, notification flags had already reached senior leadership channels, and soon, someone at headquarters would recognize the name immediately. 43 minutes after Naomi Carter left the Harrington and Cole branch, the first unmistakable signal that something significant had shifted appeared not in the lobby, but within the bank's internal executive communication system. A notification marked Priority Visibility reached the secure inbox of Margaret Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Harrington and Cole Financial Group. Unlike routine compliance alerts, this one carried a legacy tag, a digital identifier used only for accounts connected to historical stabilization agreements. Margaret rarely ignored legacy alerts. They represented moments in the institution's past when survival had depended on decisions made under pressure. Those decisions had shaped the bank's current structure influencing everything from branch expansion strategy to capital reserve policy. She opened the summary. Account origin, Carter. Global Strategic Holdings Principal Authorization, Naomi Carter. Transaction type. Capital allocation transfer amount, $750,000. Branch location, Chicago. West Monroe Street. Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair. She knew that name. 3 years earlier, during a period of financial contraction affecting mid-sized regional institutions, Harrington and Cole had faced a capital stability crisis triggered by sudden liquidity withdrawal from 2 institutional partners, without immediate intervention. The bank would have been forced to freeze expansion plans and possibly close several branches in emerging markets. At that time, Carter Global Strategic Holdings had provided silent stabilization capital funding structured through layered agreements designed to prevent market panic. The arrangement had been negotiated confidentially with minimal public disclosure to protect both institutions. Margaret remembered the negotiation clearly. The representative for Carter Global had insisted on governance transparency rather than publicity. The principal decision-maker had chosen not to attend the final press conference. Instead, a single signature had authorized the capital release. Naomi Carter. Margaret opened the full record. The stabilization agreement showed Carter Global as the lead capital guarantor for a multi-phase liquidity reinforcement plan that enabled Harrington and Cole to maintain operational continuity. Without that agreement, the Chicago branch itself might never have remained open. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. She selected the internal review option. A subnote appeared. Transaction flagged for executive visibility due to legacy capital origin. Margaret opened the interaction summary. Branch manager oversight recorded. Extended verification protocol applied. Duration 19 minutes beyond standard processing time. She frowned slightly. Extended verification for a legacy partner. She opened the branch activity log. Notes indicated additional identity confirmation steps, layered questioning, and behavioral observation coding. Margaret's fingers paused above the keyboard. She pressed the direct contact request. Within seconds, an internal message routed to Daniel Brooks's secure communication panel. Request. Confirm client interaction context. Daniel, seated in his office reviewing the printed restructuring summary for the 3rd time, noticed the incoming alert immediately. Sender Executive Office. His pulse increased slightly. Executive Office rarely contacted branch managers directly without intermediate compliance communication. He opened the message. Please confirm details regarding interaction with client Naomi Carter. Daniel's stomach tightened. Melissa looked toward him from across the desk. What is it? She asked quietly. Daniel turned the monitor slightly so she could see. Melissa inhaled sharply. That was fast, she murmured. Daniel straightened his posture, instinctively adjusting his tie again. He typed carefully. Client transaction processed according to enhanced verification protocol. He paused, then added all documentation verified and transfer completed successfully. He hesitated before pressing send. Across the country, Margaret Whitmore read the response. Her expression remained composed, but her attention sharpened. She opened the behavior coding summary attached to the branch log. Observation markers indicated repeated identity confirmation prompts, extended questioning beyond automated compliance requirements. Margaret exhaled slowly. She selected Initiate Call. Back in Chicago, Daniel's phone vibrated softly against the desk surface. Incoming executive call. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. Daniel answered immediately. Daniel Brooks speaking. Daniel, Margaret Whitmore said calmly. This is Margaret Whitmore from the executive office. Daniel sat straighter in his chair. Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. I'm reviewing an interaction record involving a client named Naomi Carter, Margaret said. Yes? Daniel replied carefully. Can you briefly describe the context of your extended verification process? She asked. Daniel chose his words cautiously. The transaction involved a significant capital movement, and we applied layered compliance procedures to ensure accuracy. Margaret paused. The client's account classification indicates legacy partner status, she said. Daniel's throat tightened slightly. Yes, he replied. Were you aware of the origin of that classification before initiating extended questioning? Margaret asked. Daniel hesitated. We became aware of additional context shortly after processing, he admitted. Margaret remained silent for a moment. Ms. Carter's firm provided primary stabilization capital during our liquidity contraction 3 years ago, she said. Yes, Daniel replied quietly. The Chicago branch currently operates within expansion parameters made possible by that capital, Margaret continued. Daniel felt the words settle heavily. Yes, he said again. Margaret's tone remained calm but precise. I would like a detailed summary of the interaction, she said. Of course, Daniel replied. Melissa watched silently from across the desk, reading Daniel's expression as the conversation continued. Margaret spoke again. Daniel Institutional Partners should not experience unnecessary procedural friction when documentation aligns with compliance standards. Daniel swallowed slightly. Understood, he said. Margaret paused. I will be scheduling a review call with your regional director within the hour, she added. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. The call ended quietly. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Melissa spoke softly. She knows, she said. Daniel nodded. The significance of the interaction now felt unmistakable. Not merely a transaction, not merely a misunderstanding, but a moment recorded within institutional memory, a moment now visible beyond the walls of the Chicago branch. Daniel looked down at the printed restructuring summary again. Naomi Carter. The name now carried weight he could not ignore, because the quiet client they had questioned had not simply held an account at Harrington and Cole. She had helped ensure the institution still existed. And now the first signal of the twist had reached the highest level of leadership, a signal that would soon reshape the interpretation of everything that had occurred that morning. The silence inside Daniel Brooks' office felt heavier than any conversation that had taken place earlier that morning. The call with Margaret Whitmore had been calm, professional, controlled, yet its implications reverberated through Daniel's thoughts with increasing clarity. Information that had existed quietly in restricted files now stood at the center of his awareness, forcing him to reconsider every assumption that had shaped the interaction with Naomi Carter. Melissa Grant remained seated across from him, her posture more rigid than before. The confidence she typically carried during routine client interactions had been replaced by careful restraint. She replayed the exchange repeatedly in her mind, each question she had asked now sounding different in retrospect. She never corrected us, Melissa said quietly. Daniel looked up slowly. She did, he replied after a pause. Melissa frowned slightly. She mentioned restructuring capital. Daniel continued. We didn't recognize the significance. Melissa lowered her eyes briefly. The difference between information being available and information being understood had never felt more consequential. Daniel opened the institutional archive again, this time reading beyond the summary section. The stabilization agreement detailed a multi-phase capital infusion structured to maintain Harrington and Cole's operational continuity during a regional credit contraction. Several institutional investors had withdrawn support simultaneously, creating liquidity pressure that threatened regulatory compliance thresholds. Carter Global Strategic Holdings had entered the negotiation quietly, without public announcement. The agreement required strict confidentiality to avoid market panic. The capital injection allowed the bank to continue its expansion into key metropolitan areas, including Chicago. Without that intervention, the branch Daniel now managed might not have existed. Melissa leaned slightly closer, scanning the figures. That was nearly 40 million in structured capital, she said softly. Daniel nodded. And layered guarantees beyond the initial tranche, he added. Melissa exhaled slowly. That level of exposure would require extraordinary confidence in institutional stability. Daniel nodded again. Or a willingness to assume calculated risk, he said. Melissa folded her hands together, her expression thoughtful. And we questioned her identity, she said quietly. Daniel did not respond immediately. Across the lobby, the junior employee reviewed the restricted document once more, now with clearer understanding of its relevance. The connection between Carter Global and Harrington and Cole extended beyond a single transaction. It represented a foundational moment in the bank's recent history. The employee closed the file carefully, aware that information of this significance required discretion. Inside the office, Daniel opened the compliance interaction log again. Each question he had asked now appeared differently on the screen. Verification request. Secondary confirmation. Pattern consistency inquiry. Each step had seemed reasonable when viewed independently. Together, they revealed a pattern of hesitation not supported by data. Melissa spoke carefully. The system never flagged irregularity, she said. Daniel nodded. I know. Melissa hesitated before continuing. I assumed the review was precautionary, she added. Daniel exhaled slowly. So did I. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Margaret Whitmore's words returned clearly. Institutional partners should not experience unnecessary procedural friction when documentation aligns with compliance standards. The phrase procedural friction lingered in his mind. Because friction once identified invites evaluation. Melissa broke the silence. Do you think she will file a complaint? She asked. Daniel considered the question. I don't know, he replied honestly. Melissa nodded slowly. She remained calm, she said. Daniel looked down at the interaction timeline again. She observed he replied. Melissa looked toward the glass wall separating the office from the lobby. She didn't react emotionally, she said. Daniel nodded. That doesn't mean the interaction had no impact. Melissa folded her arms lightly. I asked her about the source of her funds, she said. Daniel glanced at her. I asked her whether she understood the size of the transfer, he added quietly. Both statements now felt heavier. Because context changes meaning, Daniel's computer displayed a new internal message notification. Regional Director Review scheduled, 11:30 a.m. Melissa noticed the alert. That was fast, she said again. Daniel nodded. Executive visibility rarely delayed review processes. Because institutional memory operates differently than daily workflow. Certain names carry significance beyond individual transactions. Naomi Carter had not presented her influence during the interaction. She had not referenced her firm's prior involvement. She had not mentioned the stabilization agreement. She had not used her position to alter the tone of the conversation. She had simply allowed the interaction to unfold. Melissa spoke quietly. Why do you think she didn't tell us? Daniel considered the question carefully. Because she shouldn't have needed to, he said. The answer settled between them. Professional environments are designed to rely on documentation, not perception. Melissa nodded slowly. That makes sense, she said. Daniel opened the interaction timeline again. Total extended duration, 19 minutes beyond standard processing. 19 minutes shaped by hesitation rather than evidence. Melissa glanced at the printed restructuring summary again. Her firm didn't request publicity for the capital injection, she said. Daniel nodded. Confidential stabilization agreements rarely involve public recognition, he replied. Melissa looked thoughtful. She supported the institution quietly, she said. Daniel nodded again. And we introduced doubt publicly. The contrast felt unavoidable. Outside the office, routine activity continued. Customers approached tellers. Keyboards clicked softly. Phones rang briefly. The external appearance of normalcy remained intact. Inside the office, understanding had shifted, because the truth was no longer abstract. It was documented, verified, historical, and connected directly to the client they had just questioned. Daniel closed the document slowly. We will provide a full interaction summary, he said. Melissa nodded. And we will review our process, she added. Daniel agreed. Because compliance frameworks exist to ensure fairness, not interpret appearance. And fairness, once examined, often reveals areas where improvement is necessary. Melissa spoke once more. She remained professional throughout, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes. The composure Naomi demonstrated now appeared not only disciplined, but intentional. Because influence rarely needs to announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply observes and waits. Within the executive office, Margaret Whitmore continued reviewing the institutional file, preparing for the upcoming regional call. The documentation confirmed what she already understood. Naomi Carter was not merely a client. She was a strategic partner connected to one of the most critical stabilization decisions in the bank's recent history. And the way institutions treat their partners often reveals how well they understand their own values. The truth had begun to surface, and the full realization of its implications had only just begun. At exactly 11:28 a.m., the internal conference system at Harrington and Cole initiated a high-priority video session request routed simultaneously to the Chicago branch office and the Regional Oversight Division. The notification appeared on Daniel Brooks's screen with a subtle but unmistakable label. Executive Conference, mandatory attendance. Daniel adjusted the position of his chair, straightened his posture, and ensured the camera angle aligned professionally. Across from him, Melissa Grant remained seated quietly, hands folded together more tightly than usual. Neither of them spoke as the system connected. The screen flickered briefly before displaying the composed presence of Margaret Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Harrington and Cole Financial Group. Her office background appeared understated, yet unmistakably authoritative neutral tones framed institutional certifications, a single abstract painting positioned deliberately behind her desk. Her expression was calm but attentive. "Good morning, Daniel," Margaret began. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," Daniel replied. Melissa inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Margaret glanced briefly at a document positioned beside her keyboard. "I would like to clarify the sequence of events regarding the interaction with Ms. Naomi Carter earlier today," she said. Daniel nodded. "Of course." Margaret continued. "Before we proceed, please confirm whether the transaction requested by Ms. Carter has been completed successfully." "Yes," Daniel replied. "The transfer has been processed and confirmed." Margaret gave a small nod. "Good." Her tone remained even neither accusatory nor forgiving. "We are reviewing the interaction context to ensure alignment with institutional standards," she continued. Daniel folded his hands carefully. "Our intention was to follow enhanced verification protocols for high-value transactions," he said. Margaret listened without interrupting. "Did the system indicate irregular activity?" she asked. "No," Daniel admitted. "Did the identification documents match account records?" "Yes." "Did the transaction align with prior account behavior?" "Yes." Margaret paused briefly. "Then please explain the rationale for extended questioning beyond automated compliance prompts," she said calmly. Daniel inhaled slowly. Our goal was to ensure procedural accuracy, he replied. Margaret's gaze remained steady. Procedural accuracy relies on evidence, she said. Yes, Daniel acknowledged. Margaret turned slightly, referencing another document. Ms. Carter's account classification reflects institutional partner status, she said. Yes, Daniel replied quietly. Margaret continued. Carter Global Strategic Holdings provided primary stabilization capital during the 2023 liquidity contraction period. Daniel nodded. Yes, the Chicago branch expansion remained operational because of that capital structure, Margaret added. Yes, Daniel repeated. Margaret allowed a brief silence. Ms. Carter's firm did not request public recognition for its role in maintaining our operational continuity, she said. Daniel listened carefully. Instead, the agreement prioritized long-term institutional stability. Yes, he replied. Margaret leaned slightly forward. Institutional partners should experience professional consistency across all client-facing interactions, she said. Daniel felt the weight of the statement settle clearly. Yes, he said. Margaret's tone remained composed, yet unmistakably firm. Please describe the tone of the interaction from your perspective, she requested. Daniel hesitated briefly. The conversation remained professional, he said carefully. Margaret inclined her head slightly. Professional language can still communicate unintended assumptions, she replied. Melissa lowered her gaze slightly. Margaret continued. Our compliance frameworks are designed to protect clients while ensuring equitable treatment, she said. Yes, Daniel acknowledged. Margaret reviewed the interaction timeline again. 19 minutes of additional questioning occurred after verification alignment was confirmed, she said. Daniel nodded. That is correct. Margaret paused again. Ms. Carter did not reference her institutional role during the interaction, she observed. No, Daniel confirmed. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained measured. Strategic partners often prioritize discretion, she said. Yes. Margaret folded her hands lightly. The absence of self-identification should not result in elevated scrutiny when documentation already satisfies compliance thresholds, she continued. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. Melissa spoke quietly for the first time. We recognize that the process extended beyond necessary verification, she said. Margaret acknowledged her statement with a slight nod. Recognition is an important first step, she said. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Margaret spoke again. Our institution operates within a financial system that requires constant evaluation of procedural consistency, she said. Yes, Daniel replied. Margaret continued. When procedural caution becomes selectively applied, it introduces risk not only to client relationships, but to institutional credibility. Daniel understood the implication clearly. Yes, he said. Margaret glanced briefly at the restructuring agreement summary displayed on her screen. Carter's capital partnership contributed directly to maintaining employment continuity for over 1,200 staff members during the 2023 contraction cycle, she said. Daniel felt the number settle heavily. Yes, he replied. Margaret continued. Our responsibility includes ensuring that all clients, particularly those connected to our institutional stability, experience interactions aligned with our stated values. Daniel nodded. We will review our internal training protocols, he said. Margaret gave a small nod. That will be appropriate, she replied. Melissa spoke again quietly. We regret that the interaction extended beyond necessary verification steps. Margaret acknowledged the statement. I appreciate your transparency, she said. Her tone remained calm, yet her words carried quiet authority. A formal review summary will be prepared for regional compliance evaluation, she continued. Yes, Daniel replied. Margaret paused briefly. Ms. Carter has not submitted a complaint, she added. Daniel felt a subtle shift of relief. However, Margaret continued, the absence of complaint does not eliminate responsibility for reflection, she said. Daniel nodded again. Yes. Margaret's gaze remained steady. Our institutional values require consistency even when outcomes appear technically correct, she said. Daniel understood. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. Margaret allowed a final moment of silence. We will consider this interaction an opportunity for structural improvement, she concluded. Yes, Daniel said. Margaret gave a small nod. Thank you for your time. The video connection ended. The screen returned to the neutral interface of the conference system. Daniel remained still for a moment, processing the conversation. Melissa exhaled slowly. She knew everything she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, because documentation preserves context long after moments pass, and context once fully understood often reveals the difference between procedure and perception. Naomi Carter had not raised her voice. She had not referenced her influence. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply allowed the interaction to reveal its own structure. And now the institution itself had acknowledged the significance of what had occurred. The decisive turning point had arrived. The truth was no longer emerging. It was fully visible. At 1:12 p.m., a second executive communication reached Daniel Brooks' secure terminal. Unlike the earlier review request, this message carried a formal subject line that left little room for interpretation. Executive Directive, Client Relationship Priority Review. Daniel read the message once, then again, ensuring he fully understood its language. Across from him, Melissa Grant remained quiet. Sensing that the situation had moved beyond procedural correction into institutional consequence, Daniel opened the directive. Effective immediately, client Naomi Carter is to be recognized under Strategic Partner Tier 1 classification across all Harrington and Cole branches. Any future interaction involving Carter Global Strategic Holdings must be routed through senior relationship management protocols. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Tier 1. That classification was reserved for individuals and institutions whose capital influence directly shaped the bank's operational capacity. Melissa read the message over his shoulder. That level is usually reserved for multinational investment groups, she said softly. Daniel nodded. The directive continued. Historical review confirms Carter, Global Strategic Holdings provided principal liquidity stabilization totaling $38.4 million during the 2023 contraction period. Additional contingent guarantees extended capital confidence levels across partner institutions. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. That explains the partner designation, she murmured. Daniel continued reading. Without the Carter Global Stabilization Structure, Harrington and Cole would have entered regulatory intervention status during Q3 2023. Daniel lowered the screen slightly. Regulatory intervention status. The phrase carried enormous weight in the financial world. It meant the institution's autonomy had once stood at risk. It meant leadership decisions had once required external confidence. It meant Naomi Carter's firm had not simply invested. It had protected institutional continuity. Melissa spoke quietly. She preserved the bank's independence. Daniel nodded. Yes. Another line in the directive appeared. Executive Office confirms direct outreach to Ms. Carter will occur through Relationship Director Angela Ruiz. Melissa glanced toward Daniel. They are assigning a senior liaison, she said. Daniel nodded again. Strategic partners rarely interacted through standard teller channels once their classification had been fully recognized. Yet earlier that morning, Naomi Carter had stood quietly at the public counter, responding to repeated questioning without invoking her institutional position. The contrast between her composure and the magnitude of her influence now felt striking. Daniel spoke quietly. She chose not to identify herself. Melissa nodded. She allowed the interaction to proceed normally. Daniel's eyes remained on the directive. Or perhaps she allowed the interaction to reveal its assumptions. The internal system displayed an additional notification. Client Relationship Recovery Protocol initiated. Daniel exhaled slowly. Recovery protocol indicated that senior leadership recognized the need to reinforce institutional trust. Melissa read the new message. "A formal acknowledgement will be prepared," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Because strategic relationships operate on more than financial metrics. They rely on confidence, consistency, mutual respect. Meanwhile, across the city, Naomi Carter sat in a quiet conference room overlooking Lake Michigan, reviewing quarterly projections with her legal counsel. Her phone vibrated once on the polished wood table, displaying an incoming message from an unfamiliar number. Angela Ruiz, Harrington and Cole Strategic Relations. Naomi glanced at the notification but did not immediately open it. Her attention remained on the financial model displayed on her tablet. Projected infrastructure growth metrics required careful evaluation. The allocation she had transferred earlier that morning represented only one element of a larger structural investment cycle. Her work continued, regardless of recognition. Back at the branch, Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the lobby window, observing the steady movement of pedestrians along the sidewalk outside. The world beyond the glass appeared unchanged. Inside, however, perception had shifted completely. Melissa remained seated at the desk, rereading the directive once more. She funded nearly $40 million in stabilization capital, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. And we asked whether she understood the size of her own transaction, he replied. The realization settled heavily. Melissa folded her hands together. She never corrected us, she repeated. Daniel looked toward the printed restructuring agreement again. She didn't need to, he said, because influence often speaks most clearly through restraint. The internal message system displayed a final update. Client Naomi Carter confirmed as principal strategic partner, maintaining 18.2% indirect capital influence within expansion portfolio. Melissa read the figure twice. That percentage places her among the top 5 external contributors to the bank's growth structure, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes, the numbers reframed everything. The quiet woman who had stood calmly at the counter earlier that morning had not merely held an account. She had shaped the trajectory of the institution's expansion strategy. Her firm's capital had enabled the opening of 12 additional branches across 3 states. Her stabilization guarantees had protected hundreds of employees from layoffs during a period of financial contraction. Her decision to invest had preserved institutional independence at a moment when uncertainty threatened stability. And yet she had walked into the Chicago branch alone, without entourage, without announcement, without visible markers of financial influence. Melissa spoke softly. She didn't dress to impress anyone. Daniel nodded. She didn't need to, because credibility rooted in substance rarely requires performance. Daniel returned to his desk. We will prepare a complete interaction summary, he said. Melissa nodded. And review our escalation protocols, she added. Daniel agreed. The lesson extended beyond one conversation. It touched the underlying assumptions shaping institutional behavior. Because fairness cannot rely on recognition. It must operate consistently regardless of perception. Across the city, Naomi finally opened the message from Angela Ruiz. The text was professional, concise. Ms. Carter, the Executive Office extends appreciation for your continued partnership. We would value the opportunity to ensure your future interactions reflect the priority status aligned with your firm's contribution to our institutional stability. Naomi read the message once, then set the phone down beside her tablet. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, because respect, when genuine, should never require revelation to exist. The twist had fully emerged. Not through confrontation, not through public correction, but through documented truth quietly asserting itself. The institution now understood what it had failed to recognize in the moment, and the balance of perception had shifted permanently. By late afternoon, the Chicago branch of Harrington and Cole operated with the same outward efficiency as any other business day. Yet internally, a series of quiet adjustments had already begun reshaping the culture of the office. What had initially seemed like a routine transaction had evolved into an institutional reflection point, a moment prompting evaluation not of financial procedure, but of professional consistency. Daniel Brooks sat at his desk reviewing the formal interaction report he was required to submit to regional compliance leadership. Every detail now carried a different weight. Language that once seemed neutral appeared more complex when examined through the lens of outcome and context. Interaction duration extended 19 minutes beyond standard processing timeline. Number of additional verification prompts 4 beyond automated requirement. Observed client response composed cooperative, concise. Daniel paused after typing the final phrase. Composed. The word felt insufficient to describe the quiet discipline Naomi Carter had demonstrated. Melissa Grant sat at the adjacent workstation reviewing updated client classification protocols sent by the Strategic Relationship Management Department. The documentation outlined revised guidance for identifying legacy partner accounts and emphasized consistent communication standards when engaging with institutional contributors. She read the key passage twice. Professional respect must be independent of perceived status indicators. Melissa leaned back slightly in her chair. The sentence felt simple, yet its implications were extensive. Earlier that morning, she had relied on visual expectation rather than system classification. Expectation had delayed recognition. Recognition had required documentation. Documentation had revealed context that should have guided the interaction from the beginning. Daniel printed the completed report and reviewed it once more before submitting it through the secure compliance channel. The review process would not involve public reprimand or dramatic disciplinary action. Harrington and Cole's executive culture prioritized structural correction rather than performative response. Yet the absence of visible punishment did not mean the moment carried no consequence, because institutional credibility develops gradually but can be tested quickly. Melissa closed the client protocol document and turned slightly toward Daniel. I keep replaying the conversation, she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. So do I, he said. Melissa rested her hands lightly on the desk. She never raised her voice, she said. No, Daniel replied. She didn't mention her firm's involvement in the stabilization agreement, Melissa continued. Daniel shook his head slightly. She allowed the process to reveal itself, he said. Melissa exhaled slowly. That requires confidence, she said. Daniel nodded. Confidence built on substance, he replied. Across the branch, the junior employee, who had discovered the restructuring document, reviewed updated internal guidelines now circulating through staff communication channels. The guidance emphasized procedural alignment with documented account classification and discouraged reliance on informal interpretation of client presentation. He read the new directive carefully. Institutional partner clients may not always present visible indicators of capital influence. Verification should rely exclusively on documented account structure and compliance metrics. The instruction reflected a shift in emphasis, from assumption to evidence, from perception to process. Later that afternoon, the regional compliance director scheduled a brief internal seminar focused on bias awareness within financial decision environments. The training session would not reference Naomi Carter directly. Confidentiality agreements protected client identity. Yet the underlying lesson was clear. Consistency must be operational, not aspirational. Melissa reviewed the upcoming training agenda. The topics included interpretation risk in client interaction, impact of expectation bias on decision timelines, alignment of compliance procedures with equity standards. She closed the agenda slowly. The conversation earlier that day now appeared less isolated and more representative of broader professional responsibility. Daniel stood and walked briefly through the lobby, observing routine customer interactions unfolding with ordinary rhythm. Tellers greeted clients politely. Documents were exchanged. Questions were answered efficiently. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Daniel now noticed subtleties he might previously have overlooked. Tone, timing, body language. The intangible elements shaping client experience. Professionalism required more than correct procedure. It required awareness. Melissa approached him near the counter. "Do you think she will return to this branch?" she asked quietly. Daniel considered the question. "I don't know," he replied honestly. Melissa nodded slowly. "I hope the next interaction feels different," she said. Daniel agreed. "Consistency must be visible," he said. Across the city, Naomi Carter concluded her afternoon meeting and reviewed the message she had received from Angela Ruiz once more. The language was respectful, measured, carefully constructed. The institution had recognized the imbalance. Recognition, however, did not alter Naomi's approach to her work. She evaluated decisions based on structural impact, not emotional response. Her firm's investment philosophy remained unchanged. Stability required discipline. Growth required patience. Influence required responsibility. Naomi did not seek acknowledgement. She sought alignment. Her phone vibrated again. A follow-up message from Angela Ruiz confirmed the bank's commitment to ensuring future interactions would reflect Naomi's strategic partner status. Naomi read the message briefly, then returned her attention to the financial projections on her screen. Her work extended far beyond one institution. Her decisions affected infrastructure projects, healthcare networks, educational endowments, systems requiring stability, systems requiring foresight, systems requiring trust. Back at the Chicago branch, Daniel received confirmation that his interaction report had been accepted for compliance review. No further immediate action required, yet the significance of the moment remained. Not as a reprimand, not as a controversy, but as a reminder, because institutions do not define their values through statements alone. They define them through behavior. Melissa closed her workstation for the day and gathered her belongings quietly. As she passed the counter where Naomi had stood earlier, she paused briefly. Not out of regret alone, but reflection. Professional environments rely on trust. Trust relies on consistency. Consistency requires awareness. The lesson did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, through documentation, through context, through recognition that respect should never depend on visible status indicators. The immediate consequence of the morning's interaction was not scandal or public correction. It was something more lasting. Institutional awareness. And awareness once established often reshapes future decisions. In the weeks following the interaction with Naomi Carter, Harrington and Cole Bank began implementing internal adjustments that extended beyond routine procedural updates. The institution did not release public statements, nor did it initiate visible public relations campaigns. Instead, the response unfolded through structural recalibration, the kind that influences long-term behavior rather than short-term perception. Margaret Whitmore chaired a leadership session focused on evaluating how decision-making frameworks operate under conditions shaped by unconscious expectation. The meeting included regional directors, compliance supervisors, and senior relationship managers. The objective was not to assign blame, but to examine the subtle mechanisms through which professional environments sometimes allow perception to influence interpretation. Compliance systems exist to create fairness, Margaret said during the session, her voice steady and measured. But fairness requires consistent application. Consistency requires awareness. The room remained quiet as participants reviewed anonymized interaction case summaries. Naomi Carter's name was not displayed yet. The structural outline of the interaction was unmistakable. A transaction aligned with documented financial history. Additional questioning applied beyond required verification steps. Tone influenced by perception rather than data. Margaret continued. Procedural accuracy alone is not sufficient if interpretation introduces uneven scrutiny, she said. Regional Director Samuel Klein nodded slowly. Expectation bias can alter decision timelines, he said. Margaret agreed. And decision timelines influence client experience. The leadership team discussed strategies to ensure verification processes remain grounded in documented evidence rather than inferred assumptions. New guidance emphasized structured awareness training designed to help employees identify moments when subjective interpretation might influence professional behavior. Within 2 weeks, Harrington and Cole introduced a refined client interaction framework across all branches. The framework did not reduce security requirements. Instead, it clarified the distinction between necessary diligence and discretionary hesitation. Training modules addressed practical scenarios in which account classification, transaction history, and identity documentation should guide tone and efficiency consistently across all client interactions. The objective was not to eliminate caution. It was to align caution with evidence. Melissa Grant participated in the first training session alongside colleagues from neighboring branches. The facilitator presented anonymized interaction scenarios that encouraged participants to examine how small deviations in tone or timing might affect professional perception. One exercise focused on language choice. Participants were asked to compare 2 statements. "We need to confirm this transaction is legitimate," versus "we are completing standard verification procedures." Both statements conveyed procedural intent, yet the emotional implications differed. Melissa noticed the distinction immediately. Language influences interpretation. Interpretation influences trust. Trust influences long-term relationships. After the session, Melissa remained seated briefly reviewing the training materials again. The lesson felt both simple and complex simultaneously. Professional respect should never depend on visible signals of influence. Later that afternoon, Daniel Brooks attended a regional leadership call reviewing the implementation of the updated framework. The discussion emphasized institutional resilience not only through capital structure, but through consistent professional standards. Samuel Klein addressed the group. "Financial institutions rely on credibility," he said. "Credibility requires predictable fairness." Daniel took notes carefully. Predictable fairness. The phrase captured the essence of the adjustment taking place, because trust grows when expectations align with experience. Margaret Whitmore concluded the session with a brief observation. "Our institutional stability depends on the confidence of those who choose to partner with us," she said. "Confidence requires professionalism that remains consistent regardless of external indicators. Meanwhile, Angela Ruiz, Senior Relationship Director, established direct communication protocols with Naomi Carter's firm. The communication did not involve promotional messaging or symbolic gestures. Instead, it focused on ensuring that Carter Global Strategic Holdings maintained efficient access to senior operational channels for future transactions. Angela approached the relationship with quiet professionalism. Her first message to Naomi emphasized structural clarity. Future capital allocations would receive direct coordination support through designated institutional channels. The message avoided exaggerated language. It emphasized alignment. Naomi reviewed the communication briefly. Her response remained concise. Consistency in process is appreciated. Angela understood the meaning immediately. Professional environments function best when procedures operate predictably. Recognition alone does not restore confidence. Consistency does. Within the Chicago branch, small behavioral adjustments became visible over time. Employees relied more consistently on account data rather than informal interpretation. Verification language became more standardized, reducing ambiguity in tone. Customers experienced efficient interactions shaped by clear procedural alignment. No announcements were made. No public acknowledgement occurred. Yet the operational culture shifted subtly. Daniel observed the changes during daily workflow reviews. Transaction timelines normalized. Communication patterns reflected greater clarity. Employees appeared more attentive to the difference between necessary diligence and unnecessary friction. Melissa noticed the change as well. Her interactions became more deliberate. Questions became more precise. Tone became more neutral. Professional consistency required conscious practice. Several weeks later, Naomi Carter authorized another capital allocation through Harrington and Cole's institutional channel. This time, the coordination occurred directly through Angela Ruiz's office. The process required minimal clarification. Documentation aligned. Verification completed efficiently, no extended questioning. No deviation from standard procedure. Angela sent a brief confirmation message. Transaction completed successfully. We appreciate the continued partnership. Naomi read the message and returned her attention to her firm's broader investment strategy. The moment at the Chicago branch had not altered her objectives. Her focus remained directed toward structural impact. Investment decisions required long-term perspective. Short-term interactions rarely influenced strategic direction. Yet professional consistency reinforced confidence in institutional reliability. Back at Harrington and Cole, Margaret Whitmore reviewed quarterly relationship stability metrics. Carter Global Strategic Holdings remained among the most influential contributors to the bank's expansion portfolio. Margaret noted the continued partnership with quiet satisfaction. Because institutional resilience depends on relationships grounded in mutual respect. Respect requires consistency. Consistency requires awareness. The interaction that began with hesitation had ultimately strengthened the institution's understanding of its own responsibility, not through public correction, but through structural refinement. Justice in professional environments often appears not as punishment, but as improvement. Several months later, the story of that quiet morning at the Harrington and Cole Chicago branch no longer existed as a single isolated event. It had become part of the institution's internal learning history, not as a public scandal, not as a cautionary headline, but as a subtle turning point that influenced how professionals understood the meaning of consistency. Naomi Carter never spoke publicly about the interaction. She did not post about it. She did not reference it in interviews. She did not frame it as personal injustice. Her attention remained directed toward the work she had always prioritized, building structures capable of sustaining long-term stability. Inside, Carter Global Strategic Holdings Naomi's team continued evaluating investment opportunities across sectors often overlooked by larger institutional funds. Regional infrastructure, community banking networks, healthcare supply chains, and educational funding partnerships remained central to her strategy. Naomi believed that resilient systems created opportunity far beyond immediate financial return. Her colleagues respected her disciplined focus. She rarely allowed short-term events to influence long-term decisions. One afternoon, during a quarterly strategy session, a junior analyst asked Naomi a question after reviewing recent institutional correspondence. "Do you think financial systems are changing?" he asked. Naomi considered the question carefully before responding. "Systems evolve when individuals within them choose awareness," she said calmly. The room remained quiet as the statement settled. Awareness rarely arrives dramatically. More often it develops through reflection. Reflection leads to adjustment. Adjustment leads to improvement. Meanwhile, within Harrington and Cole Bank, the updated professional consistency framework continued shaping daily operations. Employees across multiple branches reported increased clarity regarding verification standards and communication tone. The changes did not reduce compliance rigor. They strengthened alignment between procedure and principle. Daniel Brooks noticed measurable improvements in workflow efficiency. Transaction processing times became more predictable. Communication between departments reflected clearer reliance on documented evidence rather than interpretive hesitation. Melissa Grant found herself approaching each client interaction with greater attention to language precision. She discovered that small changes in phrasing produced noticeable differences in client comfort. Instead of implying doubt, she emphasized procedure. Instead of extending hesitation, she relied on verified data. Professional confidence grew through consistent application of objective standards. Months after the interaction, Harrington and Cole's internal leadership review identified the updated framework as a positive operational development. Client satisfaction indicators increased modestly, but consistently. Margaret Whitmore reviewed the quarterly relationship stability report with quiet approval. Institutional credibility is rarely shaped by dramatic moments alone. It develops through repeated demonstration of reliable conduct. Angela Ruiz continued coordinating communication with Carter Global Strategic Holdings through structured relationship channels. Naomi's firm remained engaged in several infrastructure financing initiatives supported through cooperative agreements with Harrington and Cole. Professional alignment had been restored, not through apology alone, but through demonstrated consistency. One evening, Naomi reviewed a project proposal involving funding for regional transportation improvements connecting underserved communities to employment centers. The proposal required careful risk evaluation, yet its potential long-term impact aligned with her firm's philosophy. Her legal counsel asked whether institutional partnerships would influence allocation structure. Naomi answered simply, "Consistency creates confidence," she said. "Confidence allows progress. Progress creates opportunity. Opportunity expands stability." The principle applied across industries, across institutions, across interactions. The morning at the Chicago branch had not changed Naomi's belief in disciplined evaluation. But it had reinforced something she had always understood. Professional environments reveal their values most clearly when influence is not immediately visible. Because fairness should never depend on recognition. It should operate regardless of perception. At Harrington and Cole, new employee training sessions now included a module addressing the importance of evidence-based decision frameworks. The lesson did not reference specific clients. It emphasized professional responsibility. Procedural fairness protects both institutions and individuals. Consistency strengthens trust. Trust sustains long-term relationships. Daniel occasionally thought about the moment Naomi Carter stood quietly at the counter, responding to repeated questions with composed clarity. The memory did not produce embarrassment as strongly as it produced awareness. Awareness of how easily expectation can influence interpretation. Awareness of how important it is to rely on evidence rather than assumption. Awareness that professionalism requires constant calibration. Melissa shared similar reflections. The interaction had not ended her career. It had refined her understanding of responsibility. Because experience teaches lessons theory alone cannot provide. Naomi Carter never requested recognition for her role in stabilizing Harrington and Cole. She did not require acknowledgement to validate her contribution. Her work continued regardless of public awareness. Because impact, when genuine, does not require visibility. It requires integrity. The lesson extended beyond one bank, beyond one transaction, beyond one interaction. It reflected a broader truth. Dignity does not depend on perception. Capability does not depend on appearance. Value does not depend on recognition. Respect should exist before credentials are revealed. Because once respect becomes conditional, fairness becomes fragile. And fairness, once weakened, affects everyone. Professional environments function best when evaluation relies on evidence. Evidence requires attention. Attention requires awareness. Awareness requires intention. The story of Naomi Carter reminds us that influence often moves quietly, and the people who shape systems are not always the ones most visibly acknowledged. Sometimes they are the ones who walk into a room without announcement, complete their work without display, and allow their results to speak when necessary. Because true authority rarely introduces itself loudly, it reveals itself through impact.